hoping there's audio this time. Uh, anyway, hello once again. Welcome to Android Design in Action. I'm your host, Roman Nurik.
Hey guys, my name's Adam Kosh.
And hi, my name's Nick Butcher.
All right, so today's episode is going to be about presenting images. We're going to share a bunch of tips and tricks on how to present kind of images in a delightful way inside your apps. A lot of the things that we'll talk about today have been covered in past episodes, but we felt that it was good to have kind of a recap episode, as well as talk about some minor new things, not necessarily new in Android, but kind of new things that you should be thinking about when related to kind of showing photos and thumbnails inside your apps. So without further ado, should we get started? And Nick, do you want to introduce the design principle?
Yeah, absolutely. Images are such an important part of your user interface that they're explicitly called out in Android's design principles, which say that pictures are faster than words and that you should use them to get people's attention and be more efficient. So there's a much quicker way to express your information in your user interface by using imagery. If you have a screen full of images versus a screen full of kind of text and labels and so forth, one's going to be instantly a lot quicker to kind of understand, to kind of grok what's going on than the other. So you should really make use of them where you can. And the other thing I think is very important about this kind of principle is that a lot of these kind of devices out there these days, phones and tablets and so forth, have really kind of beautiful high resolution screens. So it's a real missed opportunity not to provide really beautiful, crisp imagery where you can to enrich your user interfaces. So should we push on?
Yep.
And one of the most important things when thinking about using imagery in your application is bearing in mind that designing for Android is designing for scale, designing for a variety of devices out there. So what that means is when you're thinking about your images and you're thinking about how they're going to display in your user interface, you need to build in a level of flexibility in there so that your user interface can work on a variety of different kind of, screen sizes and shapes, and that your imagery can stand up to that and still look good. So this is a technique that we've covered a couple of times on the show, so I'll go quite quickly over it. But one technique that works very well is to kind of respect the aspect ratio of the image you want to show, but to be a little bit more flexible about the exact bounds in which you show. And one way you can do this is using a center crop technique. So what this will do is, depending on how much space you have available to show the image, it'll kind of blow it up and crop off the sides or so forth in order to maintain the aspect ratio, but to kind of fit in the amount of space available to the image. It's a very important technique to kind of embrace. And I think, as we've said before, this technique works really, really well if you have kind of images which don't have a particular focal point. So, for example, if you have this picture of some bacon, which we always seem to come back to here on ADIA, then it works particularly well for this kind of content. But if you have people's faces, you might risk kind of cropping off something you might consider the focal point of the picture. So just bear that in mind.
Cool.
Should we move on?
Yeah.
So yeah, go
ahead. Next up, we're going to talk about different ways that you can kind of like decorate or kind of change the imagery which you're looking at. The first thing we're going to talk about here is using different masks. So Android has a kind of a particular look and feel when it comes to shapes. So, for example, you don't see many kind of pill shapes or rounded rectangle shapes, but what you will see is lots of simple geometric shapes like squares, circles, and so forth. Triangles, maybe, I don't know. But one technique you can use with your images in order to kind of like break out of a rhythm and make them pop, or in order to kind of set them out from your content somehow, is using different kind of decorations like a circular mask in this instance in order to kind of make it stand out.
The nice thing about circular masks for avatar photos too is that it's it's a bit softer. I guess in general circles are a bit softer than squares or other things like that. And they kind of it's kind of nice to unify or to tie this this visual element, the circle, to the idea of a person, right? So not necessarily circles; it could be other things, but kind of making sure that throughout your app, anytime you show a single type of object, that there's visual consistency. And using a circle mask is one of the ways in which you can achieve that, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. And moving on, here is an example from the Path application, which combines that idea of using a circle mask with providing kind of a slight white border and a drop shadow onto it, just in order to, I think, set it apart from the content, give it a little bit of kind of content protection, because if you're not sure what the color of an image is going to be, if it's user provided, you can stop that from contrasting with your background elements, for example, and make it stand out as well, giving it a little bit of visual depth.
Yep. Should we move on to text overlays? All right, so anytime you show images, and actually this is something that we'll talk about in a bit with full bleed imagery, but basically anytime you show images and you want to show captions next to those images, there's a couple of ways to do that, right? So first of all, you could obviously, you could have the photo and you could show captions below it if you have the space. But one of the ways in which you can kind of maximize the use of space, maximize the effectiveness of the photo or of the image, is to make the image take up as much space as possible and overlay any sort of metadata or titles or captions or things like that on top of the image. So here are just a couple of examples of that in action, I guess. So this is from the ADIA app, the Android Design in Action app from Andreas. And you can see that the images take up as much space as possible. There aren't big white gaps in between them, and then having text inside those gaps. This is purely kind of letting the image take up as much space as possible and using the space on top of the image as the space for the metadata. So here's another example. This is the Circa app. The Circa app is a recently updated or a recently published news app. And here, they also have the news article take up the full, or the news thumbnail take up almost, half the entire screen, maybe even a little more. And then the title is just kind of an overlay. And here are just a couple of other examples from Google Play Music and the People app. But the reason we wanted to point these out is that these are a couple of different examples, but they each use a different form of background protection. And background protection is basically the idea that if you just overlay text of whichever color, black, white, whatever, if you just overlay text over an image, very frequently the image itself is going to contrast too highly with the text, and the text won't be very readable, won't be very legible. So background protection is something that you place in the background or some effect that you provide that makes the text legible. So here's an example in the ADIA app. There's kind of a black drop, or rather a black gradient, and that's a very, very common form. Here in the top right, there's the People app, and instead of a gradient, they just use kind of a semi-transparent black rectangle. That's another common way of doing things. And then here in the Google Play Music app, the action bar is also it's using a gradient for background protection. And so whatever the background is, whatever this photo is, even if it's just pure white, you'll still be able to read the title here and see the controls. So the one thing I did want to talk about is the way Circa does it is actually very interesting. It does a combination of a slight drop shadow on the text, which alone is usually enough to make it legible, but it also applies this blurring effect. And the actual execution here I think could be a little better. There could be kind of a faded blur or something like that. It's quite a sharp edge between the blurred and not blurred image. But the idea is that they're blurring the background to provide as much contrast on the text. So anytime you see edges, like for example, in this photo, you have a turtle, and that hard edge between the turtle and the hand, that's actually visual distraction. Now in this case, when you're just focusing on the image, that's a good thing, right? You want to focus on the different details in the image. But here, where you just want kind of a more vague sense of the image, but you really want to focus on the text, they kind of blur out the background, make those edges much, much blurrier, and make the text much easier to read. So a couple of different ways to overlay text or overlay metadata on top of your photos to maximize the amount of space dedicated to images.
Another great aspect of using these kind of overlay labels is that it lets you kind of say that this whole item is the interface. It's kind of the idea of putting your content first, and that anything else is kind of within it. It's contained within it. So it's like saying on the People app, on the example where you have calling a contact, this is the thing that you can click on. This is the person. This is the kind of data item I can interact with. Mm-hmm. And there isn't another label off slightly somewhere to the side, so you have to kind of expand out the area, like to kind of click on all of it or whatever it might be. But it's completely contained. So this overlay label helps you to kind of build this kind of data-centric kind of UI.
Yeah, and it's really the image is the touch target, right? And it's almost like if you look at modern UIs versus past UIs, really the content is the Chrome, the content is the interactive target, and here when you let the image kind of when you let the image be the target, I think that you end up with a much more rich UI. So, okay, should we move on? Let's move on to full bleed. So this is kind of related to text overlays, and kind of in a similar manner, we have some similar screenshots. But here the idea is that you want to. Sorry, we keep hearing IM noises in our. Okay. Anyway, here the idea is that you want the image to take as much physical space as possible. You want it to take as much real estate as possible. You want your UI basically to be as immersive as possible. So here's an example of that, where basically rather than having the image start at the bottom of the action bar and maybe kind of pushing the rest of this content down in Google Play Music, they actually decided that, hey, why can't the image be part of the action bar? So here they use kind of a translucent action bar with, again, that background protection, and let the image go as high up as possible. And so here's basically the concept of maximum space for content, maximum space for images. When you have multiple images, like in the case of thumbnails, what that means is you want to minimize the gaps between images. You want to minimize the space between them. And so here's, again, an example of the People app where the space between each image is only about 1 or 2 dips. And the idea here is that if you had larger space, if you had larger gaps, whether they be white or black, it would be extra visual distraction. It would be kind of, it would potentially, help further the visual hierarchy, but the hierarchy here is well established already. And so extra space there would be just kind of static, static space that's not being used, that's not really kind of, really assisting in presenting this content. So I think that, the fact that there are small gaps here, I think is, it services this content really well. And then 2 quick other examples. Here's another example of a Flipboard, again, with very minimal space between photos, between thumbnails. And then here's another example of going completely full bleed, where basically the entire screen is a photo. And it's not a static photo. This is kind of an important distinction to make. It's not just a static photo that is the same for every time you launch the app. It is a piece of content. It's still very, very dynamic. So the idea here is that they spent as much space as possible showing the content, and then overlaid things on top of it in a background protected kind of way. The app branding, as well as some of the kind of things that you can look at once you open the magazine. So that's full bleed imagery. Should we move on to touch feedback?
Yeah, so touch feedback. If you've been watching our other episodes, we tend to mention this quite frequently. And that's one of the reasons for that is we actually see many apps that don't actually implement touch feedback. One of the areas where people often forget is image touch targets, or touch targets that are made up largely of images. And so one of the problems with touch feedback, where the touch target is largely made up of an image, is that you can't really engage the touch feedback on the background like you normally could with, say, text or something like that. So for touchable areas that are largely made up of an image, you should really use a sort of semi-transparent overlay that covers the full touchable area. In terms of like the color that you should use, it should really match well with whatever your sort of highlight color is or your accent color is for your application. And the focused and check state should really be about 50% of the press state in terms of opacity. So actually, let's just jump across here and quickly look at some examples. So the 2 on the left are sort of no-nos. You can see the very left example here. Oops. It's highlighting the background, and I actually increased the borders a little bit here so you could even see it. But sort of to the points that Roman was talking about just before, the full bleed imagery and the text overlays, often you won't even have any background to highlight in these cases. So that's just not really going to work where the image makes up the majority of the touch target. The second no-no example here is not having any transparency. So not only does this not look that great, but you can actually see sort of the content that you're touching behind. And here's an example of just sort of a good way to do touch feedback on a particular image. Another couple of examples, the press state and check state, and actually This is a little tricky to see here, simply because the opacity is, it's kind of it's 50%, but it's, let's see if we can zoom in a bit. You can see it's slightly darker here than it is here, but it's a little tricky to see. So here's a few good examples of touch feedback where the image is the majority of the touch target. So on the left here we have Google Play on the left here we have Google Play Music, and you can see here they're highlighting the entire card, and they're also using the accent color, the sort of orange accent color that sort of matches with Google Play Music. The second example here is in Google Play, the App Store itself, and this is one of the collections, the beautiful apps collections. So you can see here the cards are actually larger, and again the entire card is being highlighted here to indicate the touchable region. And you can see here the text is not overlaid, the description of the application it actually falls below the main image, but the entire touch target is being highlighted. And then the last example here is the Google I/O 2013 application. And you can see the avatars that we were talking about before with the rounded circle. And in this case, just the circle of the image is being highlighted.
And as you were saying before, I think this is an excellent opportunity to kind of really embed your branding in there. So I think Google Play Music is doing a great job there with extending its orange branding into the touch states. Holo design language is in no way prescriptive about color, and you should really see this as an opportunity to break away from that default Holo blue and really kind of bring your own branding to the table.
Yeah, definitely. All right, should we move on to focus?
Yeah, absolutely. While images are beautiful and great for grabbing attention, sometimes that's not exactly what you want, and you want to be able to emphasize other information or kind of mute that information somehow. So some good examples of doing that we've picked out to showcase today. The first one here is from the Currents app, a Google app for kind of reading news feeds. So on the left we can see there's a news feed with kind of nice big beautiful pictures and kind of a title and strapline and so on. But once you've actually read that story and you kind of come back up to the list view story, they do something quite interesting. They actually completely grayscale the image, and they mute the text as well. So it fades away visually because I've kind of processed that. I don't need to go back to that, and it makes it really easy to kind of pick up where you left off or see what you've read and what you haven't read. So I think this is a great example of having both beautiful images and then like subduing them when you want them to not grab the attention so much. And just a second example, just to show its versatility, is actually when I was taking a screenshot of the Currents app, I noticed that the screenshot notification in the notification bar does the same thing. So the kind of notification bar, you're going to be rubbing shoulders with all kinds of different content. Most of it going to be presented by the system. It's going to have a uniform look and feel. So if you were to use kind of a full bleed, like very kind of colorful image there, it might look really out of place, and it might kind of be quite a jarring experience. It might not look like a notification. So they do a nice job of desaturating the image there, so that you can, it fits in better with its surroundings, and you can focus on what's important, which is kind of the touch target and the secondary action to share.
All right.
Cool.
Should we move on to the next one?
Yeah, a slight variation on this is combining that kind of desaturation with the touch feedback that Adam was talking about. Sometimes if you just apply a kind of semi-transparent highlight over the top of an image, you can get unexpected results with colors bleeding through and so forth, especially if it's kind of user-generated content and you don't know what it's going to be. To apply slightly more control to this, you can actually combine these techniques and on touch, desaturate out the image and then overlay your touch feedback to give a slightly more controlled appearance. So in this example, I didn't include the natural state, but it was kind of a maps image that had kind of like grays, blues, yellows. But we kind of muted those colors and just applied the touch target to have a slightly more controlled effect.
Yeah, so I think, with Google Play Music as another example, orange doesn't really, overlay well with some other colors. So, desaturating and then applying the orange, almost like applying a, I think it's a hue layer in Photoshop, just kind of manually changing the hue of every color, in the image. They can kind of make it a more even look to the photo.
Cool. The next example of providing focus in the application is using blur effects. So similar to the Circa example you saw earlier, I think this is a Yahoo Weather application which it's kind of trying to run in two modes here in the same screen. So on the first screen, it wants to give as much prominence to this beautiful imagery, which it sources from Flickr, right, showing just how rainy London is. But then when you want to show more information on the screen, when you scroll up to show, the forecast and so forth, you want to mute that information. So they do a great job of applying a blur effect there to kind of really re-emphasize the content shade, so that the content is now prominent rather than the imagery. So this is a great technique.
Yep. Should we move on to Grant?
Yeah, the last kind of focus technique we want to talk about is just really applying a dimming effect. So you can use this to great effects, just to kind of show an imagery, and then as you scroll some text over the top, in this example from Grand Street, it then just applies this kind of fade mask on top of it in order to give some background protection to the text and bring the text to the forefront of the attention as well. This can be really simply achieved for developers just by setting the kind of the hint flag on an image as well.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Tint, not hint. Sorry.
All right, let's talk a little bit about placeholders. I think most apps actually do get this right for the most part, but any image that loads in your UI that has any sort of load time, any load time at all, should really have some sort of placeholder there. I was playing with an app the other day that had no placeholders, and I was just blindly scrolling through a list, not knowing what was happening. So it really gives a good visual indication to the user that something is going to load there once it gets around to loading. Ideally, you should try and tailor the placeholder to the final image if you can. If you have any sort of additional information about the image, maybe the dimensions, the colors, things like that.
Or even like a low-res cached version of the image.
Low-res cached version. And I'll show you a couple examples on the next slides about that. And then finally, when the image actually finishes loading, a sort of subtle animation to transition to the final image is definitely recommended. Normally that just means a fade in or a crossfade. You could do something a little more fancy, but I would just urge you not to go too fancy. Really, this should be quite subtle.
Yeah.
And then on the development side, you should just make sure that that image, that animation doesn't run every time the list view scrolls up and down. Getting kicked out, Nick? No. The way that the list view works, it does recycle views, so you got to make sure that the animation isn't running constantly every time that the list view is scrolling up and down. So let's have a look at some examples quickly. So this is the Google Play app again, and you can see here, and it was actually hard to get these screenshots because it does load pretty quickly. I had to go into airplane mode, but because of the sort of card-based UI of Google Play, you don't even need sort of an additional placeholder image here. The sort of card sort of already conveys that something's going to load in that space. So it's a pretty nice example of sort of baking it into the existing UI. This is the System Gallery application, and it's kind of hard to notice here, but actually they use the dimensions of the image that will load to sort of show that. I guess Nick's having some room issues.
Okay, so Nick will join.
He'll rejoin us
again soon,
shortly.
hopefully.
What was I saying? Yeah, so as I said, it's kind of hard to see here, but the dimensions of the placeholder image actually match the dimensions of the final image. So if you have a long panorama or something, it'll be thinner. And if you have a sort of portrait photo, it'll be taller.
It's almost kind of like at when an airplane is landing, it's almost like the landing strip for the airplane, right? I mean, it's kind of guiding it, or it's not really guiding the airplane. Well, in that case, it's guiding the airplane, but here it's guiding the user. Like it's saying the thing that will load will be here. It's almost like the helipad, I guess.
Yeah, and obviously it's not always possible to do this, but where you can, where you have the extra information, it's definitely a nice enhancement.
Seems like Nick has joined again. Is that right?
No.
I'm back.
There he is. There he is. Okay.
Sorry about that.
And then this placeholder example we really like. It's the Pinterest application, and I'm actually not sure exactly what they're doing. It looks like some sort of, I guess, average of the colors in the final image that will load, or something along those lines anyway. But not only do they show the sort of dimensions of the image here in the placeholder, but they also approximate the color of the image that's going to eventually load. Again, it was kind of hard to get these screenshots, and you'll see the scroll is a little offset from each other, but you can see here that the images sort of roughly match up across these two screenshots. Oops.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, like this is one extra database field, right? Just one extra database field that's computed at on the server side. It just says take the image, maybe average the pixels in some way, and store that hex color in this database row. And with that you get this massive improvement in the experience, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And Nick is gone again.
I'll just let him. All right. We'll just keep moving on, and hopefully Nick can join us again. So the next topic is full screen galleries. So the biggest advice here is you should really be using lights out mode, which and then hiding the system UI, any sort of app UI you may have, and the action bar all at the same time. Generally, that's engaged in sort of one of two ways. Normally, tapping anywhere on the screen will sort of engage lights out mode, and then tapping again will bring back all of the Chrome. And then normally there's a timeout of some sort as well, like maybe 3, 4, 5 seconds of inactivity of the user not touching anything, and the Chrome will also just fade out. Lights out mode will be engaged. The other thing you should always make sure to do is support the standard gestures. So pinch open and close to zoom in and out. Keep moving rooms, Nick.
Yeah, I think because we're running late. Anyway.
This is what happens when we do shows live.
Yeah. And then double touching to zoom in and zoom out again. And you should always use the standard sort of paging physics, as well as the standard overscroll glow that appears when you reach the edge of a gallery. And then I guess on the development side, that normally means just using the standard view pager class from the support library. For photos, there's a class called Photo View by Chris Baines, who's on our team based in London, that you can also use on the development side. The last point is really, in this particular case, touch feedback is not really required, simply because the entire screen is really the touch target. It doesn't really make sense to highlight the entire screen. And also the UI really will respond instantly to the user's touch anyway, because the lights out mode will be engaged and disengaged immediately. Any other comments, guys?
No? That's good.
One of my bugbears on this is people who don't implement the pinch physics right. So things like when you have two fingers down and you're doing a pinch, you should still be able to pan around. So I would just say use one of these standard libraries like PhotoView, because they do it all right. Mm-hmm. They kind of have the right UX embedded.
Yeah. And I'll talk at the very end when we talk about graphs. I'll share a piece of sample code that actually helps you do that as well.
Very quick sample of lights out mode being used, and actually a bit of inception here. We can show the gallery engaging and disengaging lights out mode here right now with the slides that we're using. And on the development side, there's actually a template that you can use called full screen activity. That is part of Android Studio, and is it still part of?
It's part of Eclipse.
Still part of Eclipse. You can actually go and create all of the code that will get the exact right behavior for engaging the full screen view. And then the last thing I wanted to quickly mention is transition animations. So this is an example from Tumblr, and if you're viewing posts in the screen on the left, and then you tap on one of the images, that image will actually zoom out to be full screen. And then when you tap, it actually zooms back again. And this is quite nice, so you're not sort of breaking the user's flow. On the development side, there is a class you can use called activity options. This is mostly useful though when moving between activities rather than staying within the same activity. But it can sort of help assist you build that animation between, say, a grid of photos transitioning to a full screen view of gallery photos.
And if you want to do this not between activities but between different views for the developers out there, there's actually a training class, developer.android.com/training. One of the training classes on animation specifically shows you how to do these kind of zoom ups and zoom outs animations.
All
right. So I think we were super low on time, so I'm going to quickly just jump into a bonus topic, which is graphs. So graphs aren't really, images; they're really more interactive images, if you will. But we wanted to just show a couple of quick examples of graphs done right. The first I'm going to mention that in general, these are going to be interactive graphs, so it's almost like an interactive image. So I think anytime you look at interactivity or zooming or anything like that, The gallery app, the system gallery app, is generally a very good example of that. So you can see multiple fingers going on, double touch works, and so on. So I just want to show a couple quick examples of graphs in use. Actually, you can't see that. So the first is this interactive chart demo, and this is available as in the Android training classes. So here you'll notice that you could do the same thing you can with a full screen photo view. You could zoom, you can double touch to zoom in, and then the other nice thing is that you get edge effects, right? So if you're looking to do something like a graph, or basically an interactive information-based image of some kind, this is kind of a good starting point. Another quick example is the Quotes app, and we've covered this one before. It's by the developer Michael Pardo. I think the publisher name is slightly different. But anyway, if you look at one of the graphs, they actually do things a little differently. They have this kind of zoom bar, or whatever you want to call it, I guess, and they have these little handles. And you'll notice that these handles are actually using the same visuals as text selection handles on Android, so it's very, very clear what they do. I think they're actually inverted. They should probably be facing the opposite direction, but it is still kind of cool that you can kind of do this. And then as you touch and scroll across, you see the specific values at those points. So again, those are just two quick examples. If you want to take a look at the sample code for developers for how to do that interactive chart thing, here's the code. There it is. All right. So with that, we quickly want to do a shout out to Mike Denny, who has just joined the Android Developer Relations team as an Android design advocate. He's going to be based out of Mountain View. Welcome, Mike. He'll probably be joining us on future episodes of Android Design in Action. And yeah, I think this is probably a link to his announcement post on Google+. But yeah, please all welcome Mike. All right, I think that's it for our episode after a rough start. As always, I'm your host, Roman Urich.
See you guys, Adam Kosh.
Bye from Nick Butcher.
Bye from Nick Butcher across 3 different conference rooms, is that right?
Yeah, you had a little tour of the Google London offices today. Thanks for staying with me.
Nice.
See you guys.
All right, see you guys next time.